Well, good evening, everyone. Erev Tov. Welcome to Echoes of Eden this week on this kind of sloppy Michigan Monday. So thanks for coming out, and indeed be safe as you head back home a little bit later. But we will indeed keep diving into the Torah as we are still in Sefer Shemot, the book of Exodus. And we'll talk about where we're at there after we begin with the opening blessing. So let's pray. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu le'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Lord God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments and has commanded us to be immersed into the words and the matters of Torah. Amen. So where we are at is in the 20th portion of the Torah, and that brings us in the book of Exodus to what's known as TETZAVEH. TETZAVEH, which means essentially command. Rooted in there, believe it or not, is the word mitzvah, which is where we get the word commandment or connection. And it covers Exodus chapter 27, verse 20, and goes through chapter 30, verse 10. And as we talk a little bit about the summary and what's going on in the portion, the name TETZAVEH, again meaning command, is found in Exodus chapter 27, verse 20. And in the portion, it begins with God telling Moses to receive from the children of Israel pure olive oil in order to feed, literally feed is the Hebrew that's being used, to feed what is known as the Ner Tamid. And we're going to talk about the Ner Tamid at the conclusion of this evening as we look at the being mindful of TETZAVEH. Ner Tamid literally means the eternal light, the eternal light. And here it's referring to the eternal light of the menorah, which Aaron is commanded, TETZAVEH, if you will, to kindle every day from evening till morning. In other words, this is to be a light that never goes out, hence eternal light. Ner Tamid, Ner meaning light, Tamid kind of meaning continually, ongoing. And then, of course, from Aaron, it would be passed on to whoever is the high priest. But this was one of the high priest's duty. This portion is really heavy on the priestly, not so much the duties, but the priestly clothing. And so the priestly garments are described that are to be worn by the Kohanim, that is the priests, the regular priests, the ordinary priests, while they are serving in the tabernacle. They're described that all priests, regardless of rank, all priests wore a full-length linen tunic. They wore kind of linen breeches or underwear, a linen turban, and a long sash wound above the waist. But in addition to this, the Kohen HaGadol, the high priest, the highest priest, literally the greatest priest, wore additional clothing, such as what's called the ephod, which is an apron-like garment made of blue, purple, and red-dyed wool, linen, and gold thread. They wore the koshen, or the breastplate, that contained the 12 precious stones, and inscribed on those stones were the names of the 12 tribes. And they wore a cloak of blue wool with gold bells and decorative pomegranates on the hem. And finally, they had a golden plate that was on their forehead that bore the description or the words, Kadosh le'Adonai, holy to the Lord, holy to God. We're going to spend quite a bit of time looking at these garments because, again, this is something where if you're reading through the Bible in a year, you may find it interesting that this is how they used to dress and so forth, but you may not find it particularly relevant to your life. However, as we've been kind of looking at the Torah from this archetypal perspective, we've been able to personalize a lot of it. And in this particular portion of TETZAVEH, it speaks about God's people being a kingdom of priests, that even though, yes, there is in the order of things from the tribe of Levi, these priests and high priest and so forth, that in the end, God's goal is that his people would be a kingdom of priests to the world, and specifically using the phrase that they would be a light to the nations. So the phrase light to the nations finds its origin in this week's portion. So when we think about it that way, then if we look at what this clothing, why it's so nuanced and why the scriptures spend so much time describing its color, the thread count, essentially, the number of pomegranates, and all of these things, when we find their deeper meaning, then we realize, well, we want to be priests, if you will, because as we've discovered, one of the so-called tabernacles, right, is us. We are our own tabernacle, and so we've constructed our tabernacle, and we want to be a priest in it, or we want to be a high priest of our tabernacle. Then we need to wear these same garments, not in its literal physical way, but in the spiritual way, the things that these signify. We need to make sure that we are putting them on ourselves so that our tabernacle also has a priest and a high priest over it. So a lot of time is spent and dedicated in this week's portion to the clothing of the priests. TETZAVEH also includes God's detailed instructions for the 7-day initiation of Aaron, or his ordination, if you will, and for his 4 sons, Nadab, Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithamar. And their kind of ordination into the priesthood, and for the making of the golden altar on which the incense was to be burned. So that's kind of the summary of the portion. That's what happens in the portion again. Ner Tamid, the eternal light of the menorah, the priest's clothing, and then kind of wrapping it up with the ordination not only of Aaron, but of his 4 sons. And this is where it's important to know that while all priests are Levites, not all Levites are priests. You can only be a priest if you were a descendant of Aaron and his 4 sons. That's what made you eligible for priesthood and eventually high priesthood. All right, so it's very limited. It's a kind of a club within a club, right? All priests are Levites, but not all Levites are priests. And we'll talk a little bit more about that this evening, with the idea that within the Levitical tribe, there are what's known as the Leviim and the Kohanim, the Levites, the common Levites, and the priests within that tribe. And they represent left and right, Kesed and Gevurah, mercy and boundaries and so forth. So we'll also touch on that a little bit as well. But before we kind of get into the clothing, just an interesting note about this week's portion, TETZAVEH. And that is from the moment that Moses is first mentioned in the Torah, which is in the first portion of the book of Moses, in portion Shemot. That's when Moses' name first appears in the Bible. And from that portion, from the beginning of Exodus until the very end of the Torah, until the very end of Deuteronomy, Moses' name appears in every single portion except for one. And that one portion where his name does not appear is this week's portion, TETZAVEH. So why is his name not mentioned in this week's portion? It's one of those things that should stick out to us if we're going to read the scriptures from that first century Galilean Eastern Hebraic mindset. If Moses is mentioned in every portion in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, except for one, that begs the question, why? Why is he not mentioned in this week's portion? This portion that's dedicated essentially to describing, as I've said, the clothing of the priest, as well as other matters relating to the tabernacle. But throughout this portion, God does address Moses directly. He doesn't not speak with him as he does in the other portions, but he speaks directly to Moses using the word you and not by name. Normally it's, and God spoke to Moses saying, or God will actually say Moses' name. But in this portion, he's only referred to as you. The usual explanation for this is that when Moses was pleading for the people of God after the golden calf episode, this is what he said. This is from the scriptures. He said, if you will not forgive the people, right, if you won't forgive them their sin for creating the golden calf, Moses says to God, if you will not forgive the people, erase me from the book that you have written. Okay, and it is explained in a Torah mindset, a Torah worldview, that the words of the righteous, the words of a righteous person, the words of a prophet, the words of a person of God who is inspired by the Holy Spirit, which Moses was, as he's recorded in our inspired scriptures, that their words must always be fulfilled, at least in some way. And so the tradition is that since Moses was stating his willingness to be wiped out of the Torah, and in many ways, this book that you've written could refer to the Torah. He was willing to just be written out of the Bible and his role in all of this, or it could refer to what we would call the book of life, right? Eternal life and so forth, that he was willing to be annihilated, that he was willing to give up his own covenant relationship, that he was willing to give up his own life and salvation for the sake of the people. And so it's taught that his words did, in fact, come true. They were filled full by his name not being mentioned in this week's portion known as TETZAVEH. That's the traditional explanation. That's the kind of the peshat, that's the basic explanation. But there's a deeper level that I think you'll probably begin, some of you even may begin to make the connection to Messiah through. There's a shadow of our Messiah going on here that can give us a deeper understanding of a very popular verse in the New Testament. So on a deeper level, Moses' willingness to give up his own life for the sake of the people, which is a supreme act of ego nullification, as well as a powerful foreshadowing of the Messiah, all right, being willing to give up his life so that the people, he being innocent of the sin, he being innocent of this great transgression, the golden calf, is willing to take the punishment of the guilty party so that the guilty party can receive pardon, right? That's the great exchange. That is the gospel in a nutshell. That is the work of the Messiah. And it's also a significant shift in the Torah. The Torah has great models of leadership, and you can think about from Noah to Abraham to Moses. If you study leadership at any kind of Jewish-based institution, they always will look at Noah, Abraham, and Moses to teach leadership skills. And they'll talk about Noah and his willingness as a leader to make tough calls, to make the right call even when the popular opinion is against you, to be obedient to the will of God and so forth. But if you pay very careful attention to Noah, he never really thinks too far outside of that. Like, I'm supposed to build an ark and I'm going to be on this ark and it's going to go. And he doesn't really stretch too far. You don't really see in the book of Genesis. In the book of Genesis, you don't see Noah being too concerned about other people's souls. He's pretty much very focused on the task at hand, which is very important for a leader. He knows his task, he's going to accomplish it, and he makes sure that he and his family are saved, right? Then you move on to Abraham, and Abraham has many of those same qualities, but Abraham begins to think broader than that. And so Abraham builds that tent, and it's open on all four sides, and he wants to welcome visitors from afar, and he wants other nations and cultures coming in so that he can teach them about the one true God. But he doesn't go quite to the extent of being willing to sacrifice himself. If you reject his truth, he lets you move on your way. Then you get to Moses, who now Moses' act of leadership is that of servant leadership, that he's willing to sacrifice even himself for the sake of those that he's leading. And so what this all boils down to is Moses had reached essentially the highest level of the soul, like nullifying your ego, getting out of your own way, thinking of others before yourself, even to the point of being willing to die for the sake of others. Moses reaches this incredible level of the soul, which is beyond speech. It's beyond name. This is why Moses in Exodus is often described as having that speech problem. It's not that he stuttered. It's not that he was afraid of public speaking. It's not any of those things. It's that he was exposed to something in the upper realm. He saw God in a way no one else had seen God. He had experienced God in a way no one else had experienced God, and he had no words for it, right? It was beyond speech. And so at a deeper level, Moses' name is not mentioned here because he had reached that incredible height of crucifying oneself, right? He had died to himself. Okay, and that is beyond name. And so his name is not mentioned. And it's interesting to note, during most years, this week's portion, TETZAVEH, when we read the Torah, we always want to read it in the times, right? So what's going on in God's calendar, usually at the time when TETZAVEH is read? And for us, it's about, well, I think it's about 7 days away. It's about a week away. It's the festival known as Purim, 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 which is a biblical festival. It's found in the book of Esther. So the book of Esther is all about Purim. It's where the holiday of Purim is established. And I don't want to go into all the details of Esther, review that in a summary on your own. But what's interesting is this time of year, the book of Esther is also read and studied within the cycle of living in the times. Okay, so within the next week, those who follow the Torah schedule will also have read the book of Esther. And what's interesting in the book of Esther is that this is one of two books, one of two, it's not the only one. People often think it's the only one. It's one of two where the name of God is not specifically mentioned, at least directly. At least directly. If you go online into the archive page on my teachings and you look at the Esther class, I demonstrate for you where God's name does appear in Esther, but it's not in a direct way. It's not in a spoken way. Nowhere in the book of Esther does it say Lord or God or El Shaddai or Almighty. Nowhere in the book of Esther. It's hidden. In fact, that's one of the meanings of the name Esther. It means to be hidden. It comes from the Hebrew word astir, meaning to be hidden. And that one of the themes of Esther is the whole idea that so often in the difficult times of our life, such as when the Jews in Persia had the plot essentially of a Holocaust, where a guy named Haman was going to eliminate and kill every Jew in the land, that's often when God seems the most distant. When you need him the most, that's when you can't find God. When you need him the most, that's when it seems your prayers go answered. When you need him the most, when you're the most alone, you're the most brokenhearted, that's when it seems like he's not there walking beside you. He's austere, he's Esther, he's hidden. But yet when you read the whole book of Esther all the way to its conclusion, you see that his handprint was all over it all of the time. All right? And so when we are reading Esther and when God's name is hidden, we are reading the portion where Moses' name is also hidden. So here too, Moses is not mentioned by name directly, but his presence is felt in this portion as much as anywhere else when his name is mentioned. And it's a powerful lesson of the book of Esther, is how to experience God or see the fingerprint of God when you don't actually see God. All right, and that probably describes much of our life because we live in such a spiritual climate where God's presence is, in fact, very distant from us. And so Esther's a great guide for trying to make sense of that, and it's perfect for this time of year. And so Moses is kind of like that. This is indicated by God, as I said, addresses Moses directly as you, like you, which is different from the way of describing the relationship, which is a different way of describing their relationship. Elsewhere in the Torah, God says that he spoke to Moses face to face. And elsewhere, it's described in the Torah that God spoke to him mouth to mouth. And elsewhere, it's described that he spoke to Moses as a friend. And so by removing the personal name and making it you, it also is kind of invoking that personal relationship where it's you. You're my friend. I don't have to be so formal with you. And by rising to this level that is above names, Moses reaches the level of being that is described by the rabbis as being in the image of God. When you become in the image of God, meaning that you have removed so much of your ego and yourself, you've been able to get out of your own way, right? And this is why in the book of Numbers, it describes Moses as the most humble man that ever lived, right? So if we think the Bible is the divinely inspired word of God and it tells us Moses is the most humble man that lived, guess what the answer to the question of the most humble man who ever lived is? It's Moses. It's right out of the scriptures. That when you reach that level, you're described as being in the image of God because you have reached a level beyond yourself. That you've gotten in touch with that image that we were created with in the garden. So just as the divine has many names, but the essence of the divine is beyond any real description or name, so too Moses, and by extension, our Messiah, the greater Moses, can attain a taste of being above and beyond their appointed name. All of which is to say, maybe this rings differently now. Therefore, God has highly exalted him, Messiah, Jesus, and bestowed on him the name that is above every name. That can't just be Yeshua, Jesus, because I don't know, there must have been 50,000 dudes named that and when this was written, right? And there's still Joshua's running around. My rabbi in Israel, his middle name is Yeshua. Right? Even today. It's not describing that name. What's it describing? It's describing that this particular individual has reached this status of being in the image of God, of nullifying the self, of being willing to sacrifice themselves for the sake of others, even to the point of being willing to pay the punishment of something that they did not do so that those who did the transgression might receive life instead. That is the name above every name because it's in a different realm. All right. Now, priest's clothing. Why so much talk about the priest's clothing, right? What is the big deal? Well, hopefully by now we've learned we take the Bible serious enough that if it's going to develop a whole lot of ink to something, it's got to be important. And again, when we take the archetypal level and we understand that this tabernacle that's being constructed isn't just the physical one out in the wilderness, though, yes, that happened, and yes, it followed those dimensions. And as we discovered last week, somehow they were able to find a unicorn to get the skin off of, right, to make certain parts of it, right? It is that, but it's also talking about, well, how are we going to become this dwelling place for God? Because remember, God said, make me a mishkan, make me a tabernacle, make me a dwelling place so that I may dwell in them, not it, them, you, people. He wants to dwell in people. And so we've got our tabernacle, and we looked in the New Testament where Paul talks about that we are tabernacles, that we are temples. All right, and Jesus uses this language. John uses this language of Jesus. John 1, verse 14. The Word became flesh and quite literally tabernacled among us. All right, so this image of tabernacle. Well, a tabernacle has to have a priest. So who's going to be the priest of your tabernacle? You are. So what do you need to clothe yourself with? Well, let's find out. In the Talmud, a question was asked why the passage describing the priestly garments is juxtaposed next to the passage detailing the various sacrificial offerings that are to be brought when the tabernacle is open for business. So it's describing that when the tabernacle opens, after this 7-day ordination, installation of Aaron and his 4 sons, and the tabernacle finally opens for business on day 1, these are the sacrifices to be brought in, and that's paired with the description of the priest's clothing. And so that caused the question, why are these two things discussed together? What's the connection? And the answer provided is that it's to teach that just as the sacrificial offerings were to bring connection of earth to heaven, that they were to bring repair, that they were to bring atonement for various sins or misconnections or improper connections or misdeeds, just as the sacrifices were to help be the conduit to affect above and below, heaven and earth, sinners and sinless, finite and infinite. The sacrifices were part of all of that. In Hebrew, the word for sacrifice is korban, Korban, korban. And it doesn't literally mean sacrifice in the sense of like an animal, though an animal can be that. Korban literally means to be brought near. And so what a korban, what a sacrifice is anything that brings you near to God. So this is how Jesus is a sacrifice. He's not a human sacrifice. God forbids human sacrifice. So God doing human sacrifice would transgress his own law. Jesus is a sacrifice because he brings us near to the Father. He's a korban. He is a sacrifice in the most literal sense. Or when Paul says, present your bodies as a living sacrifice. Does Paul mean to go build a fire out there and throw yourself on it? Present yourself as a living sacrifice? No, he's saying present yourself to the world in such a way and live your life, be a living thing that draws people to God. That's a korban. That's a sacrifice. And so part of the sacrificial system of drawing people to God, the Talmud says they're talked together with the priest's clothing because the priest's clothing are part of that process as well. They are part of it every bit as much as is the animals or whatever, the bread, the flour, the wheat, whatever it is that is being brought to the altar as a korban. How the priests dress, how they function, all of those details matter. And then the discussion continues with a description of the connection between the 8 garments that the high priest wears and the improper connections for which those pieces of clothing actually repair or make atonement for or address. And for each one, the Talmud discusses it in depth, draws biblical verses, works through verbal tallies and all of that. And the priestly garments and the sacrifices brought at that inauguration at the tabernacle, as they're described in this week's portion, TETZAVEH, I'm just going to give you a brief list of what those 8 garments are and what they're addressing, which means then we need to begin to think, how are we going to gird ourselves spiritually to address these things? I'm saving you the 45 pages of the Talmud and all the different ways they make all of these connections, and I'm giving you the Cliff Notes version, all right? So first there is the tunic, known in Hebrew as the ketonet. And it is to atone for or to repair or to make the tikkun for bloodshed. And it starts off with the garment is atoning for the brothers, dipping Joseph's tunic in the blood of a goat in order to deceive their father Jacob. So it begins to make that repair, that when the brothers did that, it made a serious breach in the connection between heaven and earth. But it also, and then it's going to go further through. You'll be amazed at how tunic and bloodshed are connected in the scriptures, but they are. But that's one of those examples, the brothers dipping Joseph's tunic. So when the high priest wears that and goes and makes the offering, he is making the repair, the atonement for bloodshed. Then the high priest, wears trousers, michnasayim. This is connected to immorality. 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 You think about it this way, trousers is just my polite way of saying underwear or underpants, right? Well, what does underwear cover? It kind of covers your, I'm trying to be like the family show here, right? It covers your privates, right? It covers the parts that typically are involved in immorality, right? So it's there to cover our immodest part. And so it's the priest's way of bringing atonement, bringing repair, bringing tikkun for the sexual immorality. Then there is the turban, or the mitznefet in Hebrew. This is related to arrogance. As Rabbi Kanina said, let something worn high on the head come to atone for one's haughtiness, right? So someone who is arrogant, right, is full of themselves. They think too highly of themselves. If you think too highly of yourself, right, you have too much of yourself in your own head. You lift your head above everybody else and you look down on everyone else. So the head is connected to an attitude of arrogance. The sash, the avneit, unrectified thoughts of the heart. The sash was worn right below the heart, atoning for improper musings of the heart. It's also important to note that this portion says that sash is to be 32 emot. That's a measure of length. 32 emot long. 32 is the gematria, the numerical equivalent of the letters that make up the Hebrew word heart, lev. Lev is heart in Hebrew, lamed, vav, which is 32. And so this sash was worn high, not around the waist, but up by the heart. The breastplate, also known as the koshen, deals with judgment. The breastplate was actually called in Hebrew the breastplate of judgment, and it atones for misguided judgment. The apron, the ephod, deals with idolatry, quoting Hosea 3, verse 4, where there Hosea juxtaposes the ephod, the high priest apron, next to what's known as a teraphim, which was a type of idol worship. Okay, so it deals with idolatrous thoughts or having idols in your life, and not just like statues and things like that, but anything that is taking a priority and precedence over your relationship with the creator of heaven and earth. That is an idol. So your kids can be an idol, right? Your kids' sports can be an idol. Your job can be an idol. It's not just, well, I don't have any statues on my mantle in my house that we bow before, right? So we don't commit idolatry. Anything where you're going to say, is it going to be God or is it going to be this? And you go for this, that's an idol. That's an idol. And that breastplate was to make atonement for that. Or the apron. Then there's the robe, the ma'il, deals with evil speech. This is the bottom of the robe. At the bottom of the robe, the hem had the bells hanging and would thus ring as the high priest moved, atoning for the sounds of evil speech. And then there's the head plate, zitz, brazenness. The head plate was worn on the forehead, the symbolic part of the body associated with brazenness. Right? So if we're going to become high priest of our tabernacle, these are very specific things we need to make sure we've got in order, that we've dealt with, that we've been honest about, that we've confessed, that we have addressed, that we are working towards teshuvah, repentance of, and so forth. Now, to better understand how can clothing atone or make repair or reconnect from misdeeds? How can clothing do that? And so I want to touch briefly on the role of clothing in general, and then specifically within a spiritual context. Because again, this is preparing us on an archetypal level to enter into our tabernacle that we have constructed to be the dwelling place of the Shekinah, the dwelling place of God's presence in this world. How do we do this? And how can clothing do that? And what lessons are being taught for us that we can pull out of here and still apply to our lives today? So first, the sanctified garments of the priests, the Torah informs us, were made for, and this is in Exodus 28, verse 2, that they were made for glory and splendor. They were made for glory and splendor. The priests who served simultaneously as the people's representative to God, but they also, at the same time, were God's representative to the people. They served that dual role. Keep that in mind, the dual role. Glory and splendor, right? They were God's representative of the people, but they were also the people's representative of God. So it went both ways for them. And so they were commanded to dress in a manner worthy of their position and their spiritual task. All right, so this is a uniform. And just as if you talk to anybody in the military, they'll tell you when they put on their uniform, their battle uniform, there's specific reasons why there are pouches here and things over here and handles over here, right? There are reasons why the vest ends right here or goes down to there. There are reasons why the helmet goes so far down over the ears, right? It's not just like some stylist thought it looked cool or that it looked good, right? There is purpose to the design. There is purpose for the priest's clothing, right? It fits their function to be God's representative to the people and the people's representative to God, to be in this position of glory and splendor, as we'll see also in this role to the people of chesed, of loving kindness and expansive love, but also Gevurah, the left side of boundaries and judgment and justice and strictures, right? They are these things simultaneously, and this clothing is how they prepare for it, right? I can remember when I first became a pastor, and sometimes I still try to remind myself to do that. I kind of become ashamed when I don't remember the sanctity. I take my garments that I wear as a pastor very seriously. I take them very seriously, to the point like I used to kiss it before I put my stole on to remind me I am taking on the yoke of Christ. I am a poor, miserable sinner who is about to go stand in front of a congregation and be God's representative to them. And then when I turn and face with them, I'm going to be their representative to God, that I have a priestly role. And here I am, this poor, miserable sinner. And the only thing that's distinguishing me is this little fabric thing called a stole, right? It's just a stole, but yet it's not just a stole. And so I've always tried to keep my garments clean. I've always tried to put them on with respect. I've always tried to treat them that way because it's part of my office. It's part of my office. And even in a service where I don't vest, hopefully you've noticed, I still try to make it where if a complete stranger walked into our building and we're like, where's the spiritual dude? Where's the guy that's kind of over the spirit? They would not have a problem locating that guy, right? I take how I dress seriously. Where did I get that from? From my teachers. And where did they get it from? From the Word of God, right? How we present ourselves is part of our spiritual task. That is no minor thing. It is no minor thing. And so the atonement, the tikkun, the repair, the reconnection, the repair that these parts of the clothing affected on behalf of the people came through that focused intention and service of those who wore the garments for the sake of the people. By me remembering my stole means I'm taking on the yoke, right? That's why sometimes I get disappointed in myself if I just quickly throw that thing on and run out there. I'm not supposed to do that. It's supposed to be what's called kavana. It's supposed to shift my mind. It's supposed to remind me, oh, even though I'm still in this world and we're still in three-dimensional space and time, I'm about to go stand at an altar where heaven and earth do come back together, right? Where God does come down to us, literally and often in water and bread and wine and his word. I'm about to go out there and be part of that whole system, right? Slow it down, right? Take the time to put it on. Take the time to think about what it means and what you're doing. And so their clothing represented that to them. And so it in many ways did affect that, because as they were putting on something that was 32 in length, they were thinking of heart, right? And the wayward thoughts of the heart, of themselves as they represent the people to God, but also in a different way of how do they bring comfort to the people from God to them for the waywardness of their hearts, right? So being mindful of that changes how they do their task. That quite honestly, it does matter. If they just showed up in Bermuda shorts and a t-shirt, no, it would not be the same. It would not be the same if Aaron showed up in shorts and a tank top and flip-flops. It's not the same, right? It's not the same. And so the Torah spends so much time describing every detail of these sacred vestments because garments in general signify a much deeper level of meaning in the Bible, in the symbolism of the Bible. Upon deeper reflection, we see that garments simultaneously conceal, right? But they also reveal. They conceal, and we know how they conceal, right? It's modesty and things. They conceal things we don't want. But they also reveal, right? The way you show up dressed reveals something. It reveals. And these are described originally, remember in your Hebraic toolbox in your handbook, the law of firsts. Where does clothing first appear in the Bible? Way back in the garden, right? The Garden of Eden, where clothes are first mentioned. The first clothes were worn by Adam and Eve after they ate from the tree of knowledge. And in many ways, this is a fascinating study, maybe one worth its own 10-week Monday night class at some point, where the tabernacle is really a spiritual reconstruction of the pre-fallen Garden of Eden. It's mind-blowing, the connections between those. But you also are seeing that connection now with the clothing that it's repairing the fall. So after Adam and Eve ate from the tree of knowledge, before that they were described as being naked but unashamed. It wasn't a big deal. However, the first clothes were not just a consequence of Adam and Eve's fall, an accompanying sense of shame. They became a powerful symbol and a practical vehicle for spiritually uplifting modesty. The physical body and all its potential for enslavement to baser desires is concealed beneath clothing in order to reveal and express the soul that is within the body, the real essence of the individual. And also, clothing is connected to atonement. How did Adam and Eve get their first set of clothes? There was a sacrifice, right? God provided it, but there was a sacrifice. And what, if you remember, kafar, remember when we talked about that? Atonement comes from the word kafar. What's it really mean? A covering. A covering. So all the way back in the beginning, clothing is connected to atonement. All the way back. It's covering. Indeed, this explains why the verse, when it states that the priests are to wear their garments for glory and splendor, these garments concealed a lower physical reality while simultaneously revealing a divine glory shining into the physical dimension, right? It's the same reason why we do wear vestments when we do vest, because it's a way of shining something above. It's a way of saying something bigger than ourselves is going on in this place, right? And so it's concealing as much as it can my humanity, right? You don't get to talk about, well, what color shirt and tie is he wearing? Look at his pants. Look how wrinkled they are. You don't see me when I wear a vestment. What do you see? You see what that vestment's supposed to reveal, which is glory, splendor, heavenliness, otherworldliness, right? So it conceals, in many ways it conceals me, and then other ways it reveals. And it reveals that spirituality is being injected into physicality. In this light, we can begin to appreciate the symbolic nature of clothing in general, as well as its multi-layered connection between each particular garment and their corresponding human misdeeds or misconnections, revealing how they can be uplifted, rectified, repaired, and atoned for. And ultimately, these teachings apply to each person. Remember, we're to be a kingdom of priests. Not only is that mentioned here in Exodus, Peter echoes it in his epistle. And the way we dress and the way we carry ourselves reflects our sense of inner worth and essence. It conceals and it reveals. And we know that, right? We can even put it in a modern way of saying one's sense of fashion does reveal something about your inner essence. It's something you're wanting to reveal to the world. Now, we may misunderstand what you're trying to reveal sometimes. We may not quite catch what you're throwing out, right? But you are revealing something. We as priests want what we are revealing to be very clear and know that it's for glory and splendor. But I want to go even deeper with clothes because it's a big part of the portion. This is going to, and if you may want to go back to the archives of Echoes of Eden and review two portions because there is a method to my madness. When I throw some things out, I know I'm coming back to them. Sometimes I'll tell you I'm coming back to it. Other times I don't. But we're going to be going back to portion Beshalach and portion Yitro. Things that we discussed in those classes during those weeks. Beshalach and Yitro. I'll review them, but the deeper substance is covered in those two portions and echoes if you want to go back and recall it more in depth. So back in portion Beshalach, we introduced ourselves to the 72-letter name of God that is derived from 3 consecutive verses, all of which have 72 letters. 72 letters in this verse, 72 letters in that verse, 72 letters in that verse. And again, you can go back and listen to the archives. We also noted that in the portion called Yitro, Jethro, which is the portion right after Beshalach, the Torah describes the awesome events at Mount Sinai when the 10 Commandments were given. And there are 72 verses in that account. And as discussed previously, 72 is also the gematria, or the numerical value of the Hebrew word kesed. Now, whether you're in Mosaic on Sunday morning or Echoes of Eden on Monday evening, you got to know I love the word kesed, right? When do you not talk about kesed, Pastor Chad? I talk about kesed all the time because the scripture is all about kesed. In fact, this coming Sunday's Mosaic, we're going to hit kesed yet again, right? With Jesus and his teachings. Kesed, its gematria is 72. Loving kindness, mercy, grace, compassion, empathy, it just goes on and on. It's a word in Hebrew that does not have a one-word equivalent in English. You have to describe it. It's kind of like in English we have a word serendipity. Almost no other known spoken language has a word for serendipity because we made it up. All right? And so if a Chinese person needs to explain to a Chinese audience serendipity, they don't have a word for it. So they got to spend time talking about it and how it came about and what it means and then give some examples from their culture. Kesed is that kind of word. And God's kindness is shown in Yitro and Beishalach and all of that, we're at the miracles of the Red Sea, we're at the giving of the Torah at Sinai. The number 72 appears again in a significant manner in this week's portion, TETZAVEH, which describes again the clothing of the priests as they performed the services in the tabernacle and later in the temple in Jerusalem. And so this is going to be a really important clue for us as high priests of our tabernacle. So all priests wore 4 basic garments. All the priests wore the tunic, the breeches, the underwear, the turban or the hat, and the sash. The high priest had 4 more pieces of clothing: the cloak, the apron, the breastplate, and the crown. And as we'll briefly explore in a very brief way and not in any kind of extensive way, the number 72 appears many times in the description of these 4 special garments of the high priest. On the bottom of the cloak, the mail, there were sewn on the hem 72 bells and 72 pomegranates. From Exodus 28, beginning in verse 33. And on its bottom hem you shall make pomegranates of blue, purple, and crimson wool. On its bottom hem all around, the golden bells in the midst all around, a golden bell and a pomegranate, a golden bell and a pomegranate on the bottom of the hem of the robe, all around. There are 2 opinions as to the placement of these bells and pomegranates. One is that the bells were sewn within the wool tufts that looked like pomegranates, while the other is that they were placed in an alternating fashion: bell, pomegranate, bell, pomegranate. The breastplate of judgment contained a pocket in which what is called the Urim and the Tumim were placed. The root of the word Urim is or light, while the root of Tumim is tam or tamim, meaning whole, W-H-O-L-E, whole, complete, sincere. According to the Baal HaTurim, the numerical value of the phrase Ha'urim va'et HaTumim, the Urim and the Thummim, equals the phrase Shem ben Shavim v'Shetayim, the divine name of 72. And so you have this breastplate connected to 72 as well. It indicates that the divine name of 72 was inscribed on parchment and inserted into the pocket of the breastplate. And in Jerusalem, if you go to a place called the Temple Institute, which is a place dedicated to the temple research and the priests' clothing, and they have it all displayed in wonderful manner, that's what they have as the Urim and the Thummim, is it's the 72-letter name of God. And so when the high priest asked important existential questions relating to current circumstances, the letters of the 72 name of God from those passages would light up. Different letters would light up to him, and it would spell out for him the answer from God that he was looking for. The high priest would then have to permute the letters, decipher the message that was relayed from God, and give it to the people. Returning to the significance of the number 72 and its appearances in the descriptions of the clothing of the high priest, his wearing the breastplate of judgment with the names of the 12 tribes upon his heart, in addition to the names of the 12 tribes engraved on stones placed upon his shoulders, points to the very purpose of the service of the priests in general, the high priest in particular, to represent and ultimately carry the collective responsibility for all of the people, for all of the tribes, with love and a sincere sense of communal responsibility. Since 72 is always connected to Chesed, right? Loving kindness and mercy, again, clue it equaling 72, further teaches and instructs us that their role in serving the tabernacle and in the temple must literally and figuratively be enclothed in the qualities of Chesed. So when we think about our high priest, we need to be clothed in Chesed. 72 is just floating around. I'm just giving you a few of the examples because I know it's hard to listen to and all the connections and so forth. 72 in the priest's garment is all over the place. What's that really signifying? On one level, it's signifying he's clothed in kesed. Like he exudes kesed to the people. In his service of God to the people, he is kesed incarnate. And so, as high priests, if we want to be this kingdom of priests, we must be known as people clothed in kesed. And further, since the mission of God, as I said, is to be the nation of priests and a light to the nations, the attribute of kesed becomes our foundational attribute that will help God's people accomplish this goal. When we first introduced this concept in Beishalach, the manner in which the 72 three-letter names of God are revealed through these 3 consecutive verses of 72 letters, we pointed out that there are also a total of 216 verses, or 216 letters in the verses, right? 72 plus 72 plus 72 equals 216. You know what equals 216 in Gematria? Gevurah. The other side of kesed, right? So we can't always be marshmallow and fluff, right? That doesn't help anybody. It must also be balanced with Gevurah, right? And so we've talked about it in terms of right and left, finding the balance of these two. Where do mercy and justice meet? Or grace and justice meet, right? It's beautiful. It's Tiferet when they do, right? Of course, the greatest example of that for us is the cross. There's pure justice there, and there's pure kesed there, and it's a beautiful thing. It's the balancing of these two external forces. And so, as high priest, while kesed is what we're to be known for, it is to be balanced and tempered with gevurah, strength, boundaries, knowing when enough is enough, knowing when to say no, that's not good for you, and so forth, right? It still has to have that balance to it. All right, so it's speaking those words, the seemingly opposites. That's what we talked about in Beishalach. You may remember. If not, go back and listen to it. How things that seem to be opposites actually work together. It's, the living with paradox, the living with A and not A being true at the same time. Right? That's part of being the high priest. And it's embedded in their clothing. All right, now let's close by being mindful of TETZAVEH, right? So how can we kind of think about this on a really personal, spiritual level? And to do that this evening, I want to use the Ner Tamid, which is that eternal light. Aaron is commanded, he's TETZAVEH, right? He's commanded to light the menorah evening and morning, to keep that baby running, and the people are to keep it running with pure olive oil. And we could get into the gematria of what pure olive oil is and what it's really fueled with. It's maybe a different year and a different Torah class, but that is significant. So, I want to use the Ner Tamid because it's fascinating, because this is something that survived the tabernacle into the temple, post the temple's destruction into the synagogue, and from the synagogue into the church, and into the church even today. In fact, you are all going to be able to look at the remnant of the Ner Tamid right here in this chapel this evening. Boom, right? A lot of times in our church body, they're in red. It's in a little red globe. But that never goes out. That never goes out. That's a remnant from TETZAVEH and the commandment to keep the light burning always. Boom, there you go. There's some Jewish roots of your worship. So, Immanuel and most churches, at least those that have remained connected to historic, traditional, liturgical Christianity, they have a leftover furnishing from the tabernacle, demonstrating again our real roots. It's called the Ner Tamid in Hebrew, the eternal light. The Ner Tamid can fill us with hopefulness and curiosity. It's another thing that I like to do in my own personal practice as a pastor. I like to come in, whether it's very early in the morning or very late in the evening, into either here or a sanctuary and in complete darkness stare at the eternal light. Because, again, it's one of those things, it's not just symbolism. It's symbolism if you just let it, and that it's only symbolism if that's all you're going to let it be. But if you let it, again, give you kavana, focus, intention, right? Then you begin to realize even things like architecture, the way a church is structured, right? It's all designed to focus you spiritually and to affect change. It's incarnational. And so when you stare at an eternal light, it can fill you with hopefulness and even curiosity. Because we live in a world where we know everything changes. Everyone dies. And yet, there is a light that shines regardless of circumstances. No matter what storms of doubt we suffer, this small light is constant. Through the winds of change, through the tumultuous rains of shifting experience, the Ner Tamid does not falter or flicker. We are to take refuge in this light and find it within us, right? Within our tabernacle. So our tabernacle, it needs a light that never goes out. It needs a light that never goes out. Hopefully now some words like I am the light of the world and so are hitting a little differently. Or even in Luke, when Jesus is the boy child, the boy wonder, where have you been? Well, where did you think I would be? I was in my father's house. Different ways of translating the very awkward Greek, because the Greek says, didn't you know I am one of my father's things? Well, what did that mean? So we got to find a fancy way of translating that for you. What he's saying is, I am the furnishing. I'm literally one of the things. Like, I am the things that make this whole machinery run. I am that light, right? So our tabernacle needs this light that doesn't falter, it doesn't flicker, that's constant no matter what else is going on. TETZAVEH begins by blessing us with the light of eternity, the Ner Tamid. And we learn that this light, which ultimately is messianic consciousness itself. It is messianic consciousness. It is Messiah in us. It is Paul's way of saying, have in you the mind of Christ. That is the Ner Tamid. And it requires our daily attention. That does require some tending to. Just as the menorah in the tabernacle, it did require the high priest to keep fueling it. We also kind of have to fuel that bad boy. Right? It needs tending. The high priest does have to tend to it. It needs our daily attention. That's why it's consciousness. It's Messiah, but it's Messiah consciousness. As TETZAVEH goes on to describe the vestment of the priests, the ephod, the breastplate, the robes, the crown, we see that all the same colors and all the same materials that went into building the tabernacle are going into the clothes, including gold, right? Pretty much the only thing missing, I think, is like wood. Everything else that goes into the tabernacle goes into the clothes. I think you can make a connection there, right? Each of us is clothed in the garments of the tabernacle, the holy indwelling, reminding us again that God desires to make his home within us. The priest was a tabernacle. TETZAVEH describes the ceremony of consecration, that inauguration. As we become priests in service to the Shekinah, the indwelling presence of God in our lives. In honor of our devotion to this sacred work, we wear fine linens of luminous gold, shining blue techelet, royal purple, passionate scarlet, and precious jewels engraved with the sacred names of our beloved ones. Blue pomegranates and golden bells adorn the hems of our robes, and every detail is meant to remind us that this beauty has a purpose. Across our foreheads, we carry the inscription that hangs down from the crown of our priesthood that says, Kadosh Adonai, holy to or holy for God, who was, who is, and who will be the ground of our being. So when we get distracted and we get confused, it's possible to even look at the forehead of a fellow human being and to see their lives inscribed for holiness and remember what we too are working for and why we are here. TETZAVEH offers us the spiritual challenge of consecration to the priesthood. We're to be a kingdom of priests. We're to be a high priest of our tabernacle. But that means we have to be inaugurated, consecrated, ordained. And it challenges us spiritually for that. We are called to be this nation of priests, this light to the nations, and are given the opportunity to take that priesthood upon ourselves consciously and to dedicate our lives to serving the one, the holy. And within that challenge, the first requirement, notice that, the law of first from your handbook, the first requirement of this is the practice of daily tending the Ner Tamid. Daily tending your time with Messiah. Daily tending your messianic consciousness, the mind of Christ within you, the light of our consciousness. That's to be our first task every day as a high priest in our tabernacle. This is the steady practice of awareness that underlies all our other practices. And slowly I begin to identify not with the self that is continually changing, but I identify with the one who's paying attention to all of the changes. When the flame of awareness is burning steadily within me, it illuminates the act of perception rather than just the object of being perceived. And at this point, I can begin to discern the lenses through which my perception can become distorted, and I can realize when a passing mind state has colored my reality. It gives true light to reality and what is really happening around me. The challenge lies in glimpsing the pure light of consciousness and seeing that light refracted into 10,000s of colors of our subjective experience, right? Light, right, in and of itself, but what happens, it's just this constant color, right? The white light. What happens when I hit a prism, when it hits a prism? Boom, I've got the colors of the rainbow. Do I have 7 colors? No, I still have the one true light. But so often our perception can trick us into thinking, wow, look at all these colors, look at all these things, look at all of this change. And we're coming back to that theme again, that though it appears duality, though it appears multiple, though it appears segregated and fractured and shattered, it is in fact unified. Connecting with the Ner Tamid allows us to recognize that we may see many colors, what the true source of those colors are, and that it's one, and that it's one. It's only through the dailiness of practice and mindfulness, the repeated touch of the eternal, the persistent effort of the heart, the frequent affirmations of a wider expanse, that we can begin to free ourselves from the trance of our particular drama and enter into the holiness and the presence of the divine. As priests and artists of the holy, we can consciously use the elements of this world, things like color and texture and fragrance and sound and light and movement. All of those things went into the tabernacle, right? You smelt things, there was incense, you saw light, you saw colors, it was beautiful, there was artwork, there was texture, there was fabrics. We can use all of that very consciously to open the doors to the one reality. The danger lies in falling in love with the forms themselves, worshiping the words, the rituals, the idea, the artistry, rather than what those forms are pointing us to. Our spiritual challenge is to adorn and surround ourselves with a beauty that will inspire us to see the whole world